So, uh, you said you were in high school or college during the time of the Vietnam War starting like 1963.
Yes, during both high school and college, and I followed the war quite closely. In high school, we actually had a teach-in about Vietnam. I was not totally convinced one way or another that the war was right or wrong, but after listening to a college professor we brought in at our high school and a member of the John Birch Society who argued in favor of the war, I was persuaded that the war was wrong. And so that was kind of when I fixed my own position on the war, and that position against the war continued in college.
So were you eligible for the draft during the time?
I was eligible for the draft, except I had a college exemption. And interestingly, I was actually on a state committee of young people who was employed by the Selective Service agency that ran the draft, and we were supposed to advise whether or not various exemptions should be continued. And we decided the more exemptions, the better. So yes, all the exemptions for college students and so forth should be continued. Just a little sidelight, we were meeting in the state capitol on an afternoon when there was also an anti-war protest outside. So I left that committee in which we were advising about whether to give draft exemptions and went outside and joined the protest against the war at that time.
So would you say you were an active member of anti-war protests? Or was that an average college student?
Pretty average. I didn't spend a lot of time. I decided I never really wanted to do anything like vandalize property or block intersections. There was a protest at Yale where people actually blocked an intersection and went to jail. I decided blocking intersections wouldn't do anything other than make people mad at us and would not enhance support for anti-war causes. So I did that. That actually was a spontaneous demonstration when Nixon announced the bombing of Hanoi and the mining of Haiphong Harbor, which we thought was a needless escalation of the war at that point. He did it because he was going to be entering into peace negotiations and he wanted to have a strong hand to play his cards in the peace negotiations. But we just thought it was needless killing, and we were furious, and we just spontaneously poured out of our dorms and went into downtown New Haven and protested.
So would you say that Vietnam had a great impact on shaping your college experience and student life there?
It had a pretty significant experience. I mean, it was part of a typical generational divide in which the older generation is seen as doing things that really are unprincipled and don't make sense. You could almost pick your protest movement, and its origins are a difference in perspective often on the part of youth versus kind of the established generation. So I would say it wasn't so much a specific perspective with respect to the war as it was a suspiciousness about authority, which was borne out, by the way, in Nixon's the revelations about his spying on people and breaking into the Watergate and all of that, which led to Watergate and Nixon stepping down. But that was all wrapped up together, and I would say it was just in a suspiciousness or skepticism about the use of authority.
And as the war went on, the protests became more violent or more stronger, or?
It depended. There were definitely people who used Vietnam, among other reasons, to protest against what they perceived as a wrong set of priorities. I mean, there were people like the weathermen who actually exploded bombs. They were domestic terrorists. I'm not sure what the trend line was in terms of whether things over time got more violent, but certainly in the early 70s, late 60s, there were a number of groups that did use violence. I never supported that whatsoever.
So did events like Penn State I'm sure they got a lot of media, and you certainly heard about them, but were they influential
Yes. Again, that outraged us. I was in high school at the time, and a group of us wore black armbands and went out into the courtyard of our high school to protest Kent State. I mean, it was just a feeling that there was this great divide between young people who saw things clearly and saw injustices, and the establishment that was trying to basically shut us all up.
And the media you saw, was it mostly, did you see mostly anti-war stuff on the TV or the school newspaper in school, or pro-war? Or
It was the same sort of divide you might expect today, except in those days the right-wing media had not come into the prominence that it has today. Most of the media was based in New York, was moderate to liberal, and but the leading media figure of the day, Walter Cronkite, was more or less neutral about the war, but then he made a very famous statement, essentially an editorial on air, in which he said the war was unconscionable and should not be continued. And that was a major turning point in public opinion.
And with historical hindsight, do you still have the same view of the Vietnam War? Would you change anything you would have done? Would you be more powerful in your protests, or?
I think events have, in a sense, borne things out, but we've been lucky. So what does that mean? So the communist regime did take over. I know a lot of people who were boat people who risked their lives or had loved ones die either in internment camps after the war because their parents were military in South Vietnamese regime, or they had an accident, fell overboard. I mean, there were a lot of risks and a lot of hardships that people experienced because of the communist takeover. Over time, I think we have the good fortune in having a regime that is relatively enlightened, relatively willing to allow the development economically of Vietnam, and so, as with China, it's turned out a lot better than it could have if the leaders were simply ruthless dictators whose main focus was on ideological purity. Mm-hmm. But, having said that, I think we need to always be vigilant about the spread of dictatorship. Now, the reality was our dictator in Vietnam, in the South, was not that much better than the communist dictators in the North. Today, we see the rise of Putin as a dictator, probably worse than even Gorbachev, one of the communist dictators. It doesn't require a communist state to have a dictator, but I think we should always be opposed to dictatorship because it basically shackles the freedoms of people, and I think we were correct in wanting to promote freedom. We're lucky that, as it turned out, the North Vietnamese rulers at least gave a portion of freedom to their people.
And I believe you studied international law at Yale?
I originally studied political science with a focus on international relations before shifting my major to psychology.
Oh, okay. So in the classroom itself, was in Vietnam a topic?
It was. There was a famous lecturer at Yale named Bradley Westerfield, and he had a famous last lecture, and the punchline was, "Don't ask for whom the bell tolls. The bell tolls for you." In other words, if a nation falls to a repressive communist dictatorship, you should be concerned because that's part of your fellow humanity. And there were many people at Yale, the Bundys and others, who had served in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations and were politically connected. So yes, I mean, Yale, the war was certainly a topic of discussion in many classes at Yale.
All right, I think that's good enough. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben.